Welcome to Sleep Flow Studio, the place where stories slow down, voices soften, and your mind finally gets permission to rest. Here we explore calm, gentle history, told in a peaceful, sleepy flow, the kind that lets your thoughts drift, your breathing settle, and your eyes grow heavier with every minute. If you're here to relax, unwind, or simply fall asleep to something soft and comfortable, you're in the right place. So lie back, breathe slowly, and let Sleep Flow Studio carry you into rest. In the long stretch of medieval European history, one object stood quietly, unbothered, unchanged, and thoroughly overlooked. The door. While kingdoms rose and fell, while armies marched and merchants traded, doors simply existed. They did not negotiate treaties, they did not invade neighboring lands. They merely opened, closed, and occasionally creaked. This is their story. A very ordinary beginning. In the early medieval period, roughly around the 5th century, people needed something to separate the indoors from the outdoors. That simple requirement led to the development of simple wooden barriers. These were not remarkable. They were not ornate. They were not the kind of objects historians write excitedly about. They were quite simply doors. Most were made from planks of local wood. Oak was common. Elm appeared here and there. Pine was abundant but soft, making it less ideal for those who wished their doors to remain intact through more than one winter. Carpenters of the era recorded little about door making, because it was considered too mundane to deserve elaborate documentation. A door naturally requires hinges, and hinges in medieval Europe were forged by blacksmiths who rarely considered them the highlight of their careers. The earliest hinges were long straps of iron attached to the door and the frame. They were functional. They opened. They closed. Sometimes they squeaked. No one complained much. Blacksmiths did not innovate quickly. A hinge that worked was considered good enough, and so hinges changed very slowly across the centuries. Some gained slightly curved decorative flourishes, but these were so subtle that many people failed to notice them. Even today, museum visitors often walk past medieval hinges without realizing they have done so. As towns grew, more people needed houses. As houses increased, so did the need for doors. Thus, doors appeared everywhere. Farmhouses, inns, workshops, places of worship. Each door was slightly different, but not different enough to be interesting. One might be slightly wider. One might be slightly taller. Most were brown. Very few were painted because paint was expensive and doors were not considered worth decorating. By the 11th century, people realized that doors were even more useful if one could prevent someone else from opening them. This led to the adoption of simple wooden bars or metal latches. These devices were effective enough for the time, mostly because potential thieves often lacked advanced lock-picking skills or motivation. Wooden bar locks were especially common in rural areas. They consisted of a horizontal beam placed across the back of the door. When lowered, the door was locked. When raised, it was not. This system was straightforward to understand and required little explanation. Medieval doors faced many challenges, the most persistent of which was weather. Rain made wood swell. Heat made it shrink. Cold made it stiff. Wind pushed against it relentlessly. Carpenters sometimes attempted to prevent warping by using stronger wood or reinforcing planks. These attempts were moderately successful, but not remarkably so. As a result, doors frequently stuck in their frames. Residents of medieval towns often began their mornings not with prayer or breakfast, but with the gentle struggle of trying to open a swollen door. While doors were mainly functional, a few carried symbolic meaning, albeit in a very understated way. The entrance to a church, for example, might be slightly taller or slightly more ornate. Not extravagantly so, but enough that a careful observer could tell it was important. A nobleman's hall might feature a marginally larger doorway. Peasants' cottages, by contrast, had small, low doors, often requiring visitors to duck slightly. Even so, these differences were subtle. A casual traveler might not notice them at all, especially if they were tired or simply not paying attention, both of which were common. The daily life of a medieval door was predictable and mostly uneventful. At sunrise it might be opened. At midday it might remain open. At night it was likely closed. During storms it rattled slightly. During festivals it allowed people to pass through it more frequently than usual. During winters it stiffened. During summers it loosened. This pattern continued year after year without major variation. Travelers moving between towns encountered many doors. Doors of inns, barns, guild halls, and town gates. Each door served a purpose. Each door looked vaguely similar to the previous one. Some doors swung inward, others outward. A few slid sideways, though these were rare and tended to confuse unfamiliar visitors. Most travelers forgot the appearance of these doors shortly after passing through them. Doors, though rarely discussed, were essential. They provided privacy, though not much. Medieval homes were small, and doors could not block sounds effectively. They provided warmth, again not much, as drafts slipped through gaps. They provided security, mostly against animals rather than humans. Despite their limitations, doors were indispensable, even if they never received praise. Over time, doors aged. The surface roughened, the color darkened, the hinges rusted. Carpenters repaired them as needed. Sometimes they replaced one plank, sometimes the entire door. This process was not exciting, but it was necessary. Many doors lasted decades, a few lasted centuries. Those that endured often did so because no one bothered them. If medieval doors lived a quiet and uneventful existence, medieval chairs lived one even quieter. For centuries, most people simply did not use chairs at all. They sat on benches, stools, or the ground. Only a few individuals, nobles, clergy, and those with bad knees, regularly used actual chairs. Thus, the history of medieval chairs is both remarkably simple and remarkably uneventful. In early medieval homes, a chair was often nothing more than a basic wooden stool, a flat plank, 3 or 4 legs, sometimes wobbling slightly, sometimes not. Most households had at least one stool, though it wasn't assigned to any particular person. Whoever reached it first sat on it. The stool rarely broke, and when it did, the repair was uncomplicated. A replacement leg, a hammer, and a few minutes of mildly focused effort. This quiet maintenance occurred across villages with no real variation. Actual chairs, those with backs and arms, were something of a status symbol. Kings had them. Lords had them. Clergy had them. Everyone else watched from benches. A chair with a back was seen as a sign of authority. A chair with armrests suggested even more authority. A chair placed on a raised platform, often just a few inches high, suggested the authority of someone who liked being slightly taller than others. Even so, these chairs were plain by modern standards. A few carvings, perhaps. A cushion on special occasions. Otherwise, straightforward pieces of furniture. No one held parades in their honor. Medieval carpenters used whatever wood was available locally. Oak was common, strong, and heavy. Beech was used where oak was scarce. Elm appeared occasionally, though its grain could be difficult to work with. None of these woods were chosen for stylistic reasons. They were simply the woods that grew nearby. Carpenters did not hold philosophical debates about wood choices. They did not write treatises on chair making. They simply made chairs when someone ordered one and then moved on to more important tasks, like fixing a barn door or repairing a wagon wheel. In most homes, the chair, if it existed at all, belonged to the head of the household. This chair did not rotate. It did not recline. It did not fold. It simply stood there year after year, rarely moved, rarely cleaned, and rarely given much thought. During meals, the chair's occupant sat slightly higher than everyone on benches. This mild elevation was culturally significant, though only subtly so. Children might occasionally be warned not to sit in father's chair, but this was more tradition than rule. The chair itself remained entirely indifferent. During meals, the chair's occupant sat slightly higher than everyone on benches. This mild elevation was culturally significant, though only subtly so. Children might occasionally be warned not to sit in father's chair, but this was more tradition than rule. The chair itself remained entirely indifferent. Of all medieval chairs, perhaps the most uneventful were those in monasteries. These chairs were used for reading, writing, and silent contemplation. They were built to be sturdy, dependable, and entirely unremarkable. The monks who used them spent long hours seated, often copying manuscripts or quietly thinking about theological matters. The chairs creaked occasionally. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to remind the room that wood expands and contracts. No one complained. Comfort in medieval terms was not a priority. Soft cushions were rare. Backrests were a luxury. Armrests were considered extravagant. When cushions did appear, they were usually stuffed with straw. These cushions flattened over time but still offered a slight improvement over bare wood, especially during long evenings. No one wrote poetry about these cushions. They simply existed, quietly helping people sit down. In courts and noble halls, chairs played a mild symbolic role. The highest-ranking person sat in the best chair. Others sat in slightly less good chairs. Lower-ranking individuals sat on benches, stools, or sometimes simply stood. This hierarchy was neither controversial nor exciting. It was simply how things were done. Visitors rarely discussed the chairs after leaving. They were not considered noteworthy. Travelers rarely brought chairs with them because chairs were heavy. Instead, inns supplied basic stools and benches. Some inns had a single proper chair for important guests. This chair was often positioned near the fire and collected a small amount of smoke over time, becoming slightly darker than the others. Innkeepers regarded the chair with mild respect, though not admiration. It was useful. Nothing more. Chairs appeared occasionally in medieval paintings and manuscripts. They were usually shown in simple shapes: square backs, straight legs, sometimes a cushion. Nothing artistic enough to distract viewers from the subject of the image. Art historians occasionally try to analyze the significance of these chairs. Most conclude that the chairs simply supported people while they sat. Like doors, chairs aged slowly. Legs loosened. Surfaces smoothed from years of use. Backrests leaned slightly to one side. Most chairs lasted decades. Some lasted generations. A few became heirlooms, not because they were special, but because they continued to function. And so, the medieval chair lived an undramatic but useful life, providing support for countless uneventful moments. If doors opened and closed and chairs supported quiet sitting, then medieval windows served the equally undramatic task of letting in light, and unfortunately, wind. For most of the medieval period, windows were simple holes in walls, and even when they improved, they remained humble, modest, and generally ignored. This is the thoroughly uneventful tale of medieval windows. In early medieval houses, a window often meant a rectangular opening carved into the wall. No glass, no shutters, no decorations, just an opening that let in a controlled amount of daylight and an uncontrolled amount of everything else. These openings varied in size based on local climate, available building materials, and the personal tolerance of the homeowner for cold air. Some openings were large enough to let in a generous amount of breeze. Others were small enough to barely allow a bird-sized amount of light. People generally accepted this situation with quiet resignation. Since these openings let in the weather, People improvised coverings. The most common solution was the cloth. Cloth could be draped across the opening, tied back, lowered, or simply left hanging loosely. On colder days, people used mound animal skins, usually sheep or goat. These blocked wind more effectively but also blocked most of the light. The trade-off was rarely satisfying, but it was widely tolerated. These coverings were not artistic, symbolic, or decorative. They were functional and mildly helpful, and no one felt strongly about them. Eventually, wooden shutters became popular. These were simple boards attached with basic hinges. A shutter could be opened during the day and closed at night, though many households kept them partially closed at all times because they preferred warmth over brightness. Shutters offered some protection against wind, rain, and curious chickens. They also rattled softly during storms, producing a sound familiar to anyone who lived in a medieval village. A quiet tapping or gentle thudding that repeated rhythmically through the night. People grew used to this sound and found it strangely calming. Glass existed in medieval Europe, but it was expensive and difficult to make. As a result, most windows did not contain glass until very late in the medieval period. Even then, only the wealthy could afford it. Early glass panes were small and imperfect, wavy, bubbled, slightly cloudy. They distorted the view enough that people often stopped trying to look through them altogether. Instead, glass windows were appreciated simply because they let in light while keeping out wind, a combination that seemed almost luxurious. But even then, few medieval households felt compelled to install glass immediately. The change was gradual and minimally dramatic. Before large glass panes existed, people used creek lattices, crisscross structures of wood or sometimes strips of animal horn. Horn, when scraped thin, allowed a pale, diffused light to enter, though not enough to reveal anything clearly. These lattices created small patterns of light on the floor, which shifted gently as the sun moved. Children sometimes traced these patterns with their fingers. Adults mostly ignored them. The lattices rarely broke, but if they did, repairs were straightforward and unremarkable. While ordinary windows were plain, church windows gradually became more elaborate. Stonemasons carved arches. Artisans installed stained glass. Light passed through in soft colors. These windows inspired a certain amount of quiet admiration. Even villagers who rarely commented on anything architectural occasionally remarked, "That looks nice." But these ornate windows remained rare. Most people encountered far more ordinary windows every day of their lives. The role of a window in medieval life was predictable. In the morning, shutters might be opened a little. By midday, light entered gently. In the evening, shutters closed to keep out the chill. During storms, the wind whistled through tiny gaps. During winters, frost gathered around edges. During summers, insects found their way inside. People lived comfortably with these small inconveniences, seeing no need for innovation. Inns usually had larger windows than homes, partly to make the interior feel more welcoming and partly because travelers enjoyed daylight. These larger openings sometimes had multiple shutters, which could be opened at various angles, allowing light to enter from different directions. Some innkeepers installed horn windows or tiny glass panes before others did. Travelers occasionally commented on them, but only briefly and only when searching for conversation topics. The windows themselves remained quietly functional. Since most windows were shuttered, covered with cloth, or made of cloudy glass, window cleaning was not a common household task. Horn windows required polishing occasionally, but even this was done without enthusiasm or ceremony. Glass windows gathered dust, but most people simply wiped them when visibility declined significantly, which could take months. No medieval text includes detailed instructions for cleaning windows. This is understandable. The process was not complicated. By the late medieval period, windows had improved noticeably. Glass panes were larger. Lattices were finer. Shutters fit more snugly. Frames were sturdier. Even so, windows remained understated elements of medieval homes, performing their duties quietly and reliably. No single innovation transformed their role dramatically. Change occurred slowly, predictably, and without controversy. And as night fell across countless medieval towns, the soft sound of shutters closing echoed gently through narrow streets. A simple, familiar ritual marking the end of another ordinary day. Of all the things medieval people used without much thought, roads were perhaps the most ordinary. They stretched quietly across fields, meandered through villages, connected towns, and carried travelers who rarely wondered how the roads were made, or why they looked the way they did. This is the softly meandering, entirely undramatic history of medieval roads. In early medieval Europe, most roads formed naturally. People walked along the same paths repeatedly. Animals followed. Carts followed the animals. Over time, the ground packed itself down into a trail. No one officially designed these roads. They simply appeared through repeated use like folds in a frequently read book. The process was slow and required no planning whatsoever. Most medieval roads were made of dirt, soft when it rained, hard when it dried, dusty in summer, muddy in winter. Travelers accepted these conditions without much complaint, because every road was more or less the same. The uneven surface created small dips that filled with water after rainfall. These puddles remained until they evaporated or someone stepped into them accidentally. No one tried very hard to avoid such puddles. They were part of daily life. Routes between major towns received slightly better treatment. Local workers added stones to fill deep ruts. Villagers trimmed back overgrown branches. Occasionally, someone placed wooden planks over particularly muddy spots. These improvements were helpful but not transformative. A road could be smoother after maintenance, but only modestly. Travelers rarely praise these changes. They notice them briefly, acknowledged them silently, and continued walking. In many parts of Europe, old Roman roads still existed. Built centuries earlier, they remained surprisingly solid compared to medieval dirt paths. Even when medieval people didn't fully understand Roman engineering, they appreciated the firmness of these roads. Whenever travelers encountered one, they often remarked on how pleasant it felt beneath their feet or cartwheels. Still, Roman roads were not everywhere. Most medieval journeys involved far more uneven surfaces. Inside villages, roads took the form of narrow lanes, often curving gently to follow the natural layout of buildings and fields. Some lanes connected to the main road, others faded softly into footpaths. Dust gathered in dry months. Moss grew in damp areas. Children played along the edges. Animals wandered freely, leaving small reminders of their presence. Villagers navigated these roads effortlessly, having walked them their entire lives. Along many medieval roads, simple features appeared. A wooden post marking boundaries, a small pile of stones indicating direction, a lonely tree offering shade, a trough of water for animals. None of these features were grand or remarkable. They served quiet, practical purposes and blended seamlessly into the landscape. Travelers sometimes rested beside these features but rarely spoke of them afterward. Weather played a significant role in road conditions. Rain softened dirt until carts sank slightly. Dry spells hardened the ground into uneven ridges. Snow muffled footsteps and made paths slippery. Wind blew leaves, dust, and small twigs across the way. People prepared for these conditions with sturdy shoes, patient attitudes, and acceptance of mild discomfort. Roads offered no surprises. Certain roads became popular among merchants transporting goods. These roads saw more wagons, more footsteps, and more movement. As a result, they had slightly deeper ruts and slightly smoother surfaces where carts passed frequently. However, the change was subtle, nothing like the grand highways of later centuries. Merchants appreciated predictability above all. A road that looked the same every day was considered perfectly adequate. Where roads crossed streams, small bridges appeared. Some were made of stone. Most were made of wood. Wooden bridges creaked when crossed, especially by carts. The sound was familiar and mildly comforting, a natural part of travel. Stone bridges lasted much longer and required little maintenance. People crossing them rarely paused to admire the structure. They were eager to continue their journey. At night, roads grew peaceful. Lanterns lit the way for late travelers. Owls called softly from trees. Wind rustled gently across fields. Most people avoided traveling after dark, but those who did experienced the roads at their calmest. Footsteps sounded louder. Wagon wheels rumbled steadily. The world felt larger and quieter. Every bend in the road led into deeper stillness, guiding travelers gently toward their destination. Thus, medieval roads, though ordinary, provided the steady, calming pathways that shaped countless quiet journeys across centuries. If medieval roads connected places, medieval markets and connected people, but not in the loud, chaotic way one might imagine. Medieval markets were predictable gatherings where everyday goods were sold, ordinary conversations exchanged, and nothing particularly dramatic happened for centuries. This is the gently repetitive, entirely soothing history of medieval markets. Markets did not suddenly spring into existence. They developed gradually in places where roads met or where travelers naturally paused. A single vendor might begin by selling vegetables. Another vendor might join the following week with bread. A third might arrive with wool or pottery. Over months and years, these small gatherings became weekly events. Not because someone officially planned them, but simply because it seemed convenient. People liked convenience, quietly and without enthusiasm. Medieval towns often designated a central space for the market, though the market square was rarely a perfect square. Sometimes it was a rectangle, sometimes an irregular shape formed by nearby buildings, sometimes simply the widest part of the main street. The ground might be dirt, gravel, or a mixture of both. It was swept occasionally, but never perfectly clean. Still, everyone accepted it as the market's natural home. Market stalls were simple structures. Wooden tables, temporary frames, cloth roofs to block sun, boxes and baskets underneath. They were not colorful. They were not ornate. They were simply practical. Vendors arranged their goods neatly, though not artistically, and rarely changed their layout from one week to the next. Regular customers knew exactly where to find everything. This predictability was comforting. Markets produced a soft background soundtrack, the murmur of conversations, the shuffle of footsteps, the occasional bleating of sheep, the clink of metal coins, and the rustle of cloth being folded. No sound was loud or alarming. Even the animals behaved with surprising calmness, as though they understood that markets were peaceful places. These gentle noises blended into a soothing hum. Medieval markets offered a predictable range of goods: vegetables, bread, cheese, wool, simple tools, clay pots, salt, spices on rare occasions. In spring, markets had greens. In summer, berries. In fall, grains. In winter, root vegetables and dried food. No season brought shocking surprises. People simply adapted to the slow, steady cycle of the year. Towns sometimes had written rules for the market, but most people learned them simply by watching others. Don't block walkways. Keep weights honest. Treat customers politely. Start selling after the bell rings. Pack up when the bell rings again. These rules were followed with mild consistency. Disputes were rare and resolved quietly. The market was a place of order, though no one made a big deal about it. Traveling merchants visited multiple towns carrying goods from far away, cloth from other regions, salt from mines, iron tools from skilled forges. They arrived with modest wagons, set up their stalls, sold their goods, and departed. They did not rush. They did not linger unnecessarily. Their presence added gentle variety without disrupting the familiar rhythm of the market. Market day was often the most social day of the week. Villagers greeted one another, exchanged news, discussed weather patterns, complimented or commented on livestock, and made small purchases. The event was lively but never chaotic. People moved slowly. Conversations unfolded at a relaxed pace. The market felt like the calm heartbeat of community life. By afternoon, the market gradually wound down. Stalls folded. Animals were led home. Merchants counted coins. Leftover vegetables were packed away. As vendors departed, the square fell into peaceful silence. A stray leaf might drift across the ground. A dog might wander through the now open space. A final bit of dust might settle from the morning's footsteps. By evening, the market square looked as though nothing had happened at all. Across centuries, medieval markets remained remarkably consistent. They did not transform dramatically. They did not grow noisy or overwhelming. They stayed true to their quiet purpose, providing a reliable place where people could buy necessities and exchange simple greetings. And so, week after week, year after year, the markets of medieval Europe continued their gentle rhythm, peaceful, predictable, and comforting, like the steady ticking of a clock. If medieval days were filled with simple routines, medieval nights were even simpler. When the sun set, slowly, predictably, the world slipped into a calm stillness that lasted until dawn. Nothing rushed. Nothing sparkled brightly. Nothing demanded attention. This is the final, gently drifting chapter in the uneventful saga of medieval life. In the medieval world, night was genuinely dark. There were no streetlights except in a few large towns. No electric lamps. Just the soft glow of the moon, the distant shimmer of stars, and the occasional flicker of a lantern. The darkness arrived quietly. Shadows lengthened. Colors faded. Voices lowered. People adjusted to the night with the same calm acceptance they had for everything else. Darkness was not frightening. It was simply the natural backdrop of the world after sunset. As night began, households followed familiar routines. A door closed softly. A shutter was lowered. A candle was lit. A chair was moved slightly closer to the fire. Bread was sliced. Wool was folded. These motions were slow and unhurried. Children grew drowsy near the hearth. Adults spoke in gentle tones. The fire crackled softly, offering warmth and a steady rhythm. Nighttime was a time of rest, not only for people but for the entire village. Candles were precious, so people used them sparingly. Many homes relied on a single candle in the evening. Its light was small, soft, and warm. It illuminated only a small circle around it, leaving the rest of the room in peaceful shadow. Oil lamps burned with a slightly steadier flame. They smelled faintly of olive oil, fish oil, or animal fat, depending on the region. Their glow was gentle and rarely bright enough to cause eye strain. People learned to appreciate shadow as part of nightly life. Medieval nights were never silent. They were filled with quiet sounds that blended into a calming tapestry. The low hoot of an owl, the distant bark of a dog, the faint rustle of leaves, the creak of a cooling wooden beam, the crackle of embers settling in the hearth. These noises were familiar companions. People rarely noticed them consciously. They simply formed the gentle soundtrack of nighttime. Without alarms, screens, or clocks, people followed natural rhythms. They slept early, woke early, and often slept in two segments. A first sleep, followed by a quiet waking period, then a cold second sleeper. During the waking period, people might talk quietly, say prayers, stir the fire, or simply sit in calm reflection. Nothing energetic, nothing urgent, just quiet wakefulness before drifting back into gentle sleep. Even inns quieted down after dark. Travelers finished their meals, murmured their last conversations, and retreated to their rooms. The creak of wooden floors echoed softly. Lanterns dimmed. A final cup of ale was set aside. By night's deepest point, the inn felt almost as still as the countryside surrounding it. Outside the villages, the night stretched even more peacefully. Fields lay under a blanket of cool air. Crops rustled gently. Barn animals settled in their stables. Forests whispered softly with the movement of small creatures. The world seemed larger at night and slower. Each sound carried a little farther. Each breeze felt slightly cooler. But nothing disturbed the calm. In towns, a few watchmen stayed awake. They walked slowly through the streets, lanterns swinging. Their footsteps echoed faintly along stone walls. They rarely encountered trouble. Most nights were uneventful. Sometimes they paused to warm themselves by a brazier. Sometimes they exchanged a quiet word with a passing baker beginning early work. Their presence was steady and unobtrusive. At midnight, the village was at its calmest. The air cooled. Roofs glistened faintly with dew. The moon slid across the sky in slow motion. Inside homes, fires glowed softly behind shutters. A dog might stir. A rooster occasionally crowed too early, but overall stillness ruled. The entire village seemed wrapped in a warm, dark blanket. As dawn approached, the eastern sky brightened gradually. No alarms rang. No engines roared. Just a slow shift from darkness to pale morning light. Birds began their gentle calls. Cattle stirred. Doors creaked open for the day. Shutters lifted. Fires were rekindled. Another day began, slowly, softly, predictably, just as it had for centuries. And thus the medieval night concluded as quietly as it began,